Today's webinar is on confronting long COVID implications for the workplace, and it's presented by Dr. Alison Godwin. So Dr. Godwin will be sharing with us an introduction to what long COVID is, who's affected, and how it may be starting to manifest itself among workers and in our workplaces. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Godwin. So Dr. Alison Godwin holds a PhD from Queen's University in the area of biomechanics. She's the Associate Director at CROSH, and her research interests are in the area of human factors and ergonomics. So thank you, Dr. Godwin. I will turn the floor over to you, and we'll begin with a quick poll.
Thank you for the introduction, Toby, and thank you for managing all of behind the scenes things that are going on, as well as to Courtney. Now you should be able to see this poll on your screen at this point, and my main curiosity is whether you know anyone who has a diagnosis of long COVID, either in your personal life, perhaps your professional life. Maybe you've run into someone at your workplace that is actively talking about what their acute COVID infection did to them and things that they may still be experiencing several months on from that acute infection. My hunch is that this number is probably going to be quite low, but I am just interested to hear your perspective. So we're doing this webinar on March 15th. March 15th marks International Long COVID Awareness Day. And this year's theme is confronting long COVID. And they propose to do that via three main actions: recognize long COVID, prevent long COVID, act by addressing long COVID. In this webinar, whenever possible, I will frame these three actions as they pertain to the workplace, since that is our main focus at CROSH. This long COVID awareness group challenges you on the 15th month at the 15th hour to post about living with COVID, share long COVID facts, or long COVID news. And in the spirit of this initiative, and because I myself am living with long COVID, I will be using social media at 3 p.m. today to further contribute to this movement. You may also see the long COVID ribbon being used, and the three colors in the ribbon represent past, present, and future of long COVID. Gray is to represent loss and grief. Teal is for hope and support. Black is for the loneliness and isolation of the disease. Long COVID is a multisystemic condition that presents itself following an acute COVID infection. This includes both severe, mild, or even asymptomatic infections. Long COVID can occur in young and healthy people, including children. It cuts across race and ethnicity, sex, and even baseline health status. The multisystemic effects means that there are sequelae across almost all body systems, meaning long COVID may look very different in each person. The wide range of symptoms and conditions caused by long COVID can last for weeks, months, and years. The World Health Organization case definition for post-COVID-19 condition is 1, the persistence of symptoms beyond 3 months of the initial SARS-CoV-2 infection, and 2, symptoms lasting for at least 2 months and not explained by any other illness. People may appear to recover from an initial acute COVID infection, only to have symptoms appear later. To date, few people with long COVID demonstrate full recovery. Symptom manifestation may occur on different timelines, but one study showed that 85% of patients who had symptoms 2 months after the initial infection reported still having symptoms at 1 year after that infection. It is likely that there are many subtypes of long COVID, and each may have different risk factors and separate biologic mechanisms that respond to treatment in varied ways. This figure is attributed to Rahman et al. And shows how the symptoms can be grouped into the following bodily clusters. You'll see cardiovascular, respiratory, skeletal muscle and joints, renal, endocrine, dermatological, gastrointestinal, and neuropsychiatric. There are no approved drugs or treatment for long COVID. There are no blood biomarkers for diagnosis at this time. The impacts on the body are varied and individualized, as I've mentioned, and the conditions may often be hidden from employers, meaning we may not know the folks who are suffering from this in our workplaces. Now let's look at some numbers. A conservative estimate from January 2023, which is more than a year ago now, is that at least 65 million individuals around the world have long COVID. This was based primarily on the assumption of an incident rate of 10% of infections resulting in long COVID, And at the time, more than 651 million COVID-19 cases had been documented worldwide. Since that time, case reports have dropped off in most countries. So our estimates now have to come from models. So the true number is almost certainly higher. And the number is also growing every time a new variant creates a wave in a susceptible percentage of the population. Now, Worldometer current case estimates put COVID infections above 700 million. But like I said, most countries have stopped any meaningful reporting of confirmed COVID cases. Instead, statisticians are using wastewater data to model the predicted number of cases. Dr. Horger, who created this chart that you see, leads the Pandemic Mitigation Collective and uses an understanding of epidemiology to estimate the true COVID caseload in the United States. In the fall of 2023, this work estimated that new infections in the United States would peak at or about 1.5 million per day this past Christmas. And their most recent model that you're looking at predicts that in the last 85 days, more than 1 million infections per day have been occurring in the United States. So conservatively, they estimate that this latest surge has contributed another 40,000 long COVID cases per day in the United States alone. That amounts to more than 10 million additional cases in the last 4 months. CDC has recently corroborated these numbers with a new statistic released just last week. They found that the rate of people experiencing long COVID has jumped to 6.8% of all US adults. That's up from just 5.3% 4 months ago. So that represents 1 in 15 adults. That prevalence is now higher than the number of people diagnosed with asthma, and it's the highest it's been since 2022. This doesn't account for everyone who will develop long COVID from their current COVID infection. Long COVID is associated with all ages. It's not simply the oldest and sickest members of our population. The highest percentage of diagnoses are between the ages of 36 and 50 years of age. This is our working population. And a mild course of the acute disease is no guarantee for not developing long COVID. In December 2023, Stats Canada released some data on long COVID, and many news agencies around the world picked this up since it had a fairly significant impact and represented one of the most comprehensive looks at long COVID to date. The data comes from the 2023 Canadian COVID-19 Antibody and Health Survey, a follow-up questionnaire, as well as referencing the original 2022 survey under the same name. That report states that nearly 3.5 million Canadian adults have experienced long-term symptoms following a COVID-19 infection. Most common symptoms were fatigue, brain fog, and shortness of breath. 2.1 million reported they were still experiencing those symptoms as of June 2023, indicating the prolonged effect that long COVID has. Almost half of those still experiencing symptoms report that they have not seen any improvement in symptoms over time. For Canadians with these long COVID symptoms who are still managing employment and going to school, more than 1 in 5 report missing school or work due to their symptoms. On average, 24 days were missed. One of the more important statistics reported in that work was the potential impact of reinfections on the risk of developing new long COVID or exacerbating pre-existing long COVID symptoms. Until this work, it was unknown whether or not experiencing long COVID after your first infection marked you as safe from future infections or not. And this will be an important thing to understand with the ongoing endemic nature of the virus at this point. In this work, Canadians who were reporting 2 known or suspected COVID-19 cases were 1.7 times more likely to report prolonged symptoms than those who were reporting only 1 infection. And those with 3 or more infections were 2.6 times more likely to experience long-lasting symptoms. Prior to this Stats Canada work, other researchers were modeling the potential cumulative risk of long COVID, assuming that each reinfection represented a new 15% chance of having ongoing symptoms. Now, while we don't know that these things are true for each and every individual, it is interesting that the Stats Canada data superimposed on this type of model is following very closely in terms of how many people we anticipate will eventually have symptoms of long COVID. And if we look at this model by J.P. Weiland using available wastewater data from the US, it suggests that the average number of infections per person in the US currently sits at 2.7 infections, which means that the number of long COVID cases are likely going to start increasing, which will demonstrate additional issues with our workforce. The best comparable estimation of current caseload in Canada comes from Dr. Tara Moriarty's lab and is displayed here in one of the charts that she's using to try and help people understand what their current risk is. Using current infections, understanding of spread, the healthcare impact, and mortality rates, for many months, she has been providing hazard scores for each Canadian province after meaningful data has ceased being reported. So in the same time frame as the data that I previously reported for the US, roughly the last 3 to 4 months, Canada has been well above 130,000 new infections per day, and that was between November and February. Those numbers peaked sometime in early January at roughly 220,000 cases per day. Now, Dr. Moriarty attempts to estimate how that translates to long COVID cases, and they're using a somewhat lower incident rate for the number of long COVID patients. But even with this model, they are likely predicting in excess of 200,000 new COVID cases in Canada in the last 2 months alone. So how is this going to affect our working force? Few countries are gathering the data required to understand the impact that long COVID will have on our workforce. Australia estimates they have 12% of people absent from work due to long COVID. Some predict 4 million long COVID patients out of the workforce in America right now. And some of the best data is coming out of the UK at the moment. So this graph is from UK's Office for National Statistics, showing that 660,000 additional people in that crucial working age range from 16 to 64 are not economically or have become economically inactive since the start of the pandemic. So this represents an increase of more than 31% in that time frame. For this reason, it is imperative that we start to understand how this disease impacts workers and what we are going to be able to do to return them to the workplace successfully. Now we will dive into each body system that is impacted by long COVID. We begin with the respiratory system, since most people's understanding of COVID-19 is as a respiratory virus, often incorrectly compared to the flu, with predominant acute symptoms of the upper airway, like runny nose, sore throat, and coughing. However, in the respiratory cluster, the most commonly reported long COVID symptoms include breathlessness, cough, and chest pain or tightness. Breathlessness affected 33 to 39% of individuals with long COVID. The breathlessness may be a function of impaired ventilatory function and perhaps impaired diffusion capacity. Those things have been observed in hospitalized COVID-19 patients. And the capacity also demonstrates very slow recovery in our acutely ill individuals. So a good 35% of them still had diffusion dysfunction at 12 months post-discharge. This might give us a clue as to why this occurs so frequently in the long COVID cluster as well. Breathlessness is poorly predicted by typical measures of lung function, and common asthmatic treatments like bronchodilators do not improve the symptoms. This actually points to a different mechanism of causation. In fact, the vagus nerve, which controls breathing efforts, may be another target to explain that ongoing feeling of breathlessness that plagues long COVID patients. Many also have other symptoms suggestive of dysautonomia. Other levels of damage to the neural structures that control breathing may be at fault. Microvascular changes in the capillary bed and potential microclots impairing diffusion may also play a role here. Looking at the endothelial biomarkers, long COVID patients demonstrate ongoing activation and impaired repair processes to those respiratory structures. Now, we expect these patients to present in the workplace. They may have reduced working capacity. Their aerobic and anaerobic function may be reduced. So they maybe have trouble completing job tasks that they once used to be able to do. Due to the breathlessness, they may take more breaks in the workplace. They may feel the need to take a break to get their breath back. And this will start to impact the amount of work that they can do. We will see reduced overall aerobic function for these particular patients. It may also present as a discomfort. So they may take breaks in order to reduce that discomfort. One other thing I wanted to address here is that the official term for the subjective experience of breathlessness is dyspnea, and it's very difficult to measure. So you can use subjective scales from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 in order for a worker to grade their exertional dyspnea, and that would give them a score from mild to severe. The breathing pattern assessment tool has been used with asthma patients. That also has good sensitivity for evaluating long COVID patients and the amount of dysfunction that they may have due to their breathlessness. We'll move on to the cardiac manifestations. In this category, I am not including some of the more obvious and acute effects of COVID-19 infection, including patients who often present with myocarditis and various arrhythmias that may lead to heart failure or damage leading to stroke, and that's in the very acute phase of illness. I'm trying to address the persistent symptoms lasting beyond the original infection that are linked to the long COVID condition. These include things like chest pain, palpitations, and tachycardia. As mentioned in the respiratory cluster, chest pain is one of the more common manifestations, with as many as 18% of survivors at 30 days and in 13% at 60 days post-infection. Another study found chest pain in 21% of survivors at 60 days. So things that may account for that ongoing chest pain in long COVID patients include myo and pericarditis, aortic thrombosis, perhaps even things contributing to myocardial infarction. Cardiac MRI studies reveal cardiac impairment in 78% of individuals who had a prior COVID-19 episode. That was on average 71 days after infection and not even necessarily falling under the long COVID umbrella. At 1 year follow-up, those same abnormalities on the MRI is still present in 58% of participants. Atrial fibrillation is one of the more common arrhythmias reported in acute COVID cases and may present as a component of long COVID. Ventricular tachycardia, in which the heart beats too fast, is also a commonly reported symptom. Finally, the condition known as postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, has been reported in as many as 30% of long COVID patients. Although this manifests as fast heart rate, primarily related to moving from sitting or laying down to standing postures, it is actually a problem with the autonomic nervous system, so it'll be further addressed in a moment. Some of the things that might be leading to these chest pains and arrhythmias include inflammation of the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. And that's a feature of acute COVID, but it may also explain ongoing long COVID symptoms and the potential for poor cardiac outcomes. The observed chronic inflammatory response might result from persistent viral reservoirs in the heart following acute infection. And although still not really well understood, the virus appears to enable microclots forming within the blood. That can impact oxygen and gas transfer and contribute to possible dysfunction of our smallest capillaries. The impact of workers with cardiac manifestations of long COVID will include reduced work output, potentially reduced aerobic and anaerobic capacity resulting from either stroke volume impairment or oxygen extraction impairment, again, because of the diffusion mechanism being altered. Persistent endothelial dysfunction has knock-on effects for a multitude of other organ systems, which is why we see the impact throughout the body. It's also likely that they will present with reduced capacity to work in hot conditions, which warrants further attention from researchers. Neurological and cognitive symptoms are a major feature of long COVID. Brain fog is among the top 3 features described by long COVID sufferers. However, a great deal of other conditions, including sensory motor symptoms, memory loss, cognitive impairment, sleep disorders, including insomnia, headache, paresthesia, dizziness and balance issues, sensitivity to light and noise, loss of altered smell or taste, and depression or anxiety are all rooted in changes to the neurological structures. In a meta-analysis, cognitive impairment was found in 22% of patients with COVID-19 more than 12 weeks after infection. These impairments have been described as being of the same magnitude as driving under the influence or being equivalent to 10 years of cognitive aging. Recent research demonstrates that even a resolved case of COVID results in a significant drop in IQ of 3 points. Those with prolonged symptoms or unresolved symptoms, which is characteristic of long COVID, showed a drop in IQ of 6 points. One researcher has positioned these findings like this: a downward shift in IQ equivalent to 3 points would increase the number of US adults with an IQ less than 70 to a level of 2.8 million. That extra number of people are requiring significant societal support. These drops in cognitive capacity will also begin to be felt and seen in the workforce and may initially be observed as an increase in lapses and errors. Brain imaging has shown that COVID can reduce the thickness of gray matter in the temporal and frontal lobes. This is consistent with frontotemporal dementia and is accompanied by behavior or personality changes, impaired judgment, lack of empathy, socially inappropriate or impulsive behavior. These are things we may be starting to see in our workforce. A recent study has shown that reaction times of long COVID patients are twice as slow as those who have never had COVID. This suggests a significant impairment for any motor task requiring a speedy response. And these patients are responding greater than 3 standard deviations slower than healthy controls on a very simple reaction time test. This is of concern for those operating machinery and other things requiring fast response times. A report of more than 1.3 million people who had COVID-19 showed mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression return to normal over time. But those increased risks of cognitive impairment, brain fog, seizures, dementia, psychosis, and other neurocognitive conditions can persist for at least 2 years. Now, possible mechanisms for the neurological manifestations of long COVID really are focused around the neuroinflammation, but as well the damage to blood vessels or the endothelial dysfunction that is observed. Other studies are finding similar amyloid clumps like those that we would find in patients with Alzheimer's disease. I'm addressing dysautonomia specifically as a subset of the neurological symptoms. It is a broader umbrella to describe many of the symptoms found in long COVID that have apparent origins in the brain, but are in fact linked to the autonomic nervous system. And that system has control over a wide variety of body processes, from heart rate to blood pressure to digestion, respiration, immune function, and lots of other processes. The conditions that are associated with dysautonomia are well reported in the myalgic encephalomyelitis / chronic fatigue syndrome community, ME/CFS. I will use as an acronym going forward. And that is a condition that is known to be activated by exposure to a variety of viruses. The criteria for ME/CFS diagnosis includes a substantial reduction or impairment in the ability to engage in pre-illness levels of occupational, educational, social, or personal activities for at least 6 months, accompanied by a profound fatigue that is not relieved by rest, along with post-exertional malaise, unrefreshing sleep, and cognitive impairment or an orthostatic intolerance. The similarities of this condition in long COVID patients is clear. As many as half of long COVID patients are estimated to meet the criteria for ME/CFS. POTS, a condition characterized by orthostatic intolerance, has been found in as many as 67% of one cohort of long COVID patients. And long COVID patients with orthostatic symptoms show similar hemodynamic and cognitive abnormalities as ME/CFS patients. A majority of long COVID patients also report post-exertional malaise. The apparent dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system is poorly understood as an explanation for the observed symptoms in long COVID. Long COVID research has found that inflammation of the vagus nerve may account for these high levels of dysautonomia. Other researchers are considering mitochondrial dysfunction, including possible dysfunctional mitochondrial metabolism, perhaps impaired oxygen transfer, and that would especially be apparent during exercise and exertion. So this could explain the high levels of post-exertional malaise observed in long COVID patients. Up to 75% of people who have an ME/CFS diagnosis cannot work full-time, and 25% have severe ME/CFS, which often means they are bedbound, have extreme sensitivity to sensory input, and are dependent on others for care. Long COVID patients with this level of dysfunction, or probably even moderate levels, have already left your workplace. However, another subset of patients who may be considered mild may still be trying to manage their workplace duties. Ratings of severity from mild to severe is a much debated and highly subjective tool that requires some additional resource and research. Patients with orthostatic intolerance have difficulty standing for long periods of time and may need to sit more frequently. So these workers may no longer tolerate standing at all, or may be better able to tolerate walking than standing, and their job tasks would need to be adjusted to account for this. Patients with post-exertional malaise will have more difficulty, again, in managing work expectations within their known energy envelope. These workers will only be able to tolerate a certain amount of cognitive or physical efforts before needing to take a break. The term usable hours has been introduced as a way for long COVID patients to begin to manage their workload to meet their existing capacity on a given day. And usable hours may vary from day to day, hour to hour, week to week. Additional ways to document the functional capacity of long COVID workers are evolving and being adopted from the ME/CFS community. The DePaul symptom questionnaire has been trialed in long COVID patients. And a recent publication from 2023 demonstrates that the FunCap 27 questionnaire, another questionnaire, may be better suited to the challenges of quantifying functionality in the long COVID patient who has dysautonomia symptoms. This one specifically targets questions about personal hygiene, basic functions, walking and movement, being upright, activities in the home, communication, activities outside the home, reactions to sound and light, and concentration. Some of these tools will be useful for understanding how to accommodate workers in the workplace. Moving to the gastrointestinal cluster. Long COVID gastrointestinal symptoms include typically nausea, abdominal pain, loss of appetite. However, for those with evidence of dysautonomia and that ANS system dysregulation, additional gastrointestinal symptoms may present as abdominal pain and bloating, acid reflux, varying blood sugar responses, the loss of appetite, feeling full quickly or unexplained weight loss, the nausea and vomiting. Gastroparesis is a condition in particular where there is damage to the vagus nerve, and that stops food from moving into your intestines from your stomach. The why of the gastrointestinal cluster is currently focused on the gut microbiota, and it is significantly altered in patients with COVID-19. This is similar, once again, to the ME/CFS patients. Stool samples of patients with COVID-19 do show RNA copies of the virus, and at least one study has shown persistence of the virus in the feces up to 7 months later. Most patients with long COVID symptoms that dominate this gastrointestinal cluster would arguably meet the criteria for inflammatory bowel disease, and many may have antigen persistence in their gut mucosa. So long COVID sufferers in your workforce may take more days off work dealing with IBD-like symptoms and their flare-ups. They may require extra breaks throughout the day to manage eating in a way that does not disrupt or the balance of their system. They may require closer access to washroom facilities and more safe places to consume snacks and water throughout the day to maintain their nutrition and hydration. Most common long COVID musculoskeletal symptoms involve myalgia, which is pain and weakness of the muscles, back pain, muscle weakness, sarcopenia, which is a loss of muscle mass and strength. That's typically seen in old age. And the most commonly reported symptom of fatigue is lumped in here with our musculoskeletal symptoms. The pain is reported both generalized and localized, with the causes not really being apparent, although inflammation could certainly play a role here. So as we know, besides breathlessness, fatigue is the most commonly reported symptom among long COVID sufferers, and it's pinned at upwards of 75 to 80% of respondents who report it. The fatigue experienced by long COVID patients has been described as debilitating and bears resemblance to the hallmark feature of ME/CFS diagnosis, including the post-exertional malaise. So the definition: when symptoms such as disabling or exhaustion, difficulty thinking, pain, exercise intolerance, and other symptoms are made worse by exertion. Post-exertional symptom exacerbation is a similar term being used for long COVID patients. PESE is not necessarily triggered by overactivity. Patients may induce this exacerbation when exposed to what was once considered normal levels of activity. Triggers may be physical exertion, but they may also be mental exertions. Audio or visual inputs can create symptom exacerbation. Long COVID patients will likely present on a sliding scale from mild to moderate or severe, and they may fluctuate between these extremes on unknown timescales. The result is workers with reduced ability to manage their existing job responsibilities depending on flare-ups of the disease. Research among long COVID patients who experience post-exertional malaise has shown muscle abnormalities that worsen after exercise. Muscle biopsy in these patients demonstrates infiltration of, once again, amyloid-containing deposits into the skeletal muscle in these individuals. This causes a very atypical functional damage to the muscle itself. This effectively reduces exercise capacity. It also impacts exercise metabolism. So these abnormalities are not reflective of deconditioning, but they also provide a real mechanism to explain the prolonged impact of exerting outside their known energy envelope. Throughout this presentation, you may have heard potential theories as to why certain symptoms appear in long COVID patients. At this point, researchers are pursuing several hypotheses to explain the varied presentation of this disease. This recent review in Nature Reviews in Microbiology by Davis et al. Puts forward 5 potential causes, which may in fact be overlapping. And throughout the presentation, I've hinted at some of these. The virus may cause immune dysregulation, or in some cases may actually reactivate underlying pathogens in the body that manifest in a variety of symptoms. The persisting reservoirs of SARS-CoV-2 itself may remain in the tissues, able to replicate and produce the ongoing symptoms that long COVID patients experience. SARS-CoV-2 may be impacting gut microbiota, or it may be inducing autoimmunity. This may present as an exacerbation of existing autoimmune disease or acceleration of predisposing autoimmune conditions in individuals. The fibrin amyloid microclots that I've mentioned can develop post-COVID infection and can persist. They may entrap other proteins and lead to the production of autoantibodies or create accompanying endothelial dysfunction in the capillaries. This area requires further research to be able to diagnose and treat these fibrin amyloids. However, researchers argue that the ability of these fibrin amyloid microclots to block up capillaries, affect blood flow and oxygen exchange may underpin many of the long COVID symptoms we are observing. Finally, due to the predominance of dysautonomia symptoms in the long COVID list, the impact of dysfunctional signaling from, in particular, the vagus nerve should be researched. Efforts to regain stability of the autonomic nervous system may relieve many of the listed symptoms. Last month, the National Institute of Health in the United States committed an additional $515 million over the next 4 years into an initiative they have called Researching COVID to Enhance Recovery, or RECOVER for short. This nationwide research program will help to fully understand, diagnose, and treat long COVID. Their goal is to find effective treatments to reduce the burden of long COVID, recognizing that it will begin to impact large portions of a once healthy workforce. They also aim to identify methods for both diagnosis and treatment, since both of those things are preventing adequate identification of who is suffering, but also who may be at more risk. A similar investment for Canadians is sorely lacking, and many long COVID patients in Canada will find it difficult to access resources for diagnosis or treatment. This gap will likely fall to workplaces to address. This webinar has been a first attempt by CROSH to fill in the gap for our partner industries and companies. So I'd like to thank you for your time and interest in this topic. Toby's going to put up my last question, which is simply that now that you've heard how COVID may present in your various body parts, do you think anyone, either in your workplace or in your personal life, has developed long COVID post-infection and may actually be unaware of the fact that they are suffering from long COVID? And while you're answering that question, I am happy to check the Q&A. I don't see any questions in there, and I have not been monitoring the chat.
Yeah, I encourage everyone, if you've got questions, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat. Just while we're getting the poll filled out, I actually have, I've got a few questions. Well, first, that was very sobering, I think. So thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Godwin. That was really kind of brought the message home. I'm curious, have there been any reports of, say, like workplace incidents due to like long COVID correlated cognitive decline that have like been reported as of yet?
I don't think so. I'm imagining you caught on to the implications there with lapses and errors is where I'm thinking you're wondering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that if we continue to monitor some of the high risk workplaces where those errors can lead to fairly significant accidents, then we might start to be seeing some impact. But I'm not going to call out any industries in particular on that. I see Kevin is asking if this disproportionately affects women, and the answer is yes. There is plenty of research that demonstrates that women are adversely affected by some of these. Mostly the links to the autonomic nervous system seem to affect women predominantly. And I think I read something within the last 2 weeks about that being related to the extra part of the X chromosome.
And we've got a question in the Q&A. And how can we deal with the stigma some people seem to have in admitting that they have long COVID-related symptoms?
I think that's what this long COVID awareness group is trying to promote, that it certainly has to be common because of the models showing how many people are likely being affected. So how can we deal with that stigma? I think talking about it. I think if you're someone who has long COVID, you should probably start saying it and explaining what you think your symptoms are. This will help other people feel comfortable addressing it. So again, it's going to be about recognition and then acting on it.
And we've got another question in the chat as well.
Yeah, so expected recovery time, I think that's going to vary just as much as the symptoms vary. But yes, there is evidence that people are having some recovery possible. I didn't get into any of the sort of experimental drugs that are being used, but they are trying monoclonal antibodies and other things that have existed in other like long versions of illness to try and recover some function in individuals. So I do believe that recovery is possible, but just due to the lack of understanding of the mechanism, first of all, so we don't even know how to treat it. So a lot of the treatments at this point are experimental, and that is also not going to explain those who recover with certain treatments and others who are not recovering from the same treatment.
Perfect. And then in the actual chat itself, we've got a few questions. Kim is asking, are there any studies showing more people with long COVID due to contracting COVID before the vaccines were available?
Okay, so long COVID did exist before the vaccines. And I'm not sure that we can compare numbers because the number of people infected prior to the vaccine is so low compared to the number who have been infected in the last 2 to 3 years. So I will just say that long COVID was established and defined as an illness prior to the vaccines, but I'm not sure if we can talk about rates. Social work interventions, I see this question. I'd have to think about that, but I'd encourage you to send me an email perhaps, and I'd be able to think through that one a little bit better. I am not to the Bartholin gland. I'm not familiar with that connection. But certainly inflammation in general is being pinned as something that is ongoing in long COVID patients and can manifest in a variety of different ways throughout the body. I think Angela's comment here on how to accommodate all the variety of things that were discussed today certainly hints at the inadequacy of the current medical system to address this level of dysfunction. There are reports of long COVID clinics in other countries. You will hear of people going to some of these clinics to try and get answers. And so this might be another thing where Canadians don't adequately have access to be able to determine, what their accommodations need to be.
And I don't know if you saw the question from Miriam on the Bartholin gland or sit.
Yeah, I'm not got enough expertise to talk to that. Yeah. The vagus nerve is an interesting link. There are a variety of ways to stimulate the vagus nerve that are well known and are being explored as ways to recover some function from the dysautonomia list. So certainly those are easy things. Ways to stimulate the vagus nerve are as simple as breathing exercises, potentially exposure to certain vibration frequencies. Dunking your face in cold water will stimulate the vagus nerve and can recover some function. Now, these are things that will stimulate it, but are they ways to resolve the illness or the underlying dysfunction? It's too early to comment at this point. Yes, there are a number of publications showing that COVID-19 vaccination reduces the risk of long COVID. I think the problem here is that our vaccination rate is abysmally low right now, and that newer variants are showing that they are very good at infecting anyone who is susceptible. So it's at this point inadequate at reducing the burden of the number of people who may be going to develop long COVID. I'll jump to the Q&A there. So the question is, what is the likelihood that viruses prior to COVID-19 have caused similar long-term symptoms, even if less common due to lower infection rates or severity? If possible, would long COVID be more severe in these people? So the answer is yes and yes on the short answer. There is well-documented evidence to show that some of our debilitating diseases were triggered by viruses. Probably the most obvious one is AIDS being caused by the HIV virus, but there are other lesser known ones. And so yes, similar long-term dysautonomia symptoms have been observed. And yeah, one of the hypotheses from that paper that I presented at the end with the 5 mechanisms, they specifically caution that long COVID patients may be susceptible to a reactivation of those viruses, or they may be susceptible to additional long COVID symptoms on reinfection. I do not believe anyone has looked at vaccine being correlated with likelihood of long COVID. I'm unaware of that, but I may be wrong there.
And I've got another question myself. So other than, I mean, obviously this webinar group is, it's kind of a self-selecting group of individuals. How, if you had like a magic wand, how could you see us kind of sharing kind of like the main takeaways that you've shared today on long COVID and its potential impacts on the workplace?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a difficult one, Toby. As you know, there are efforts to downplay long COVID, perhaps erase it as a term altogether. And anything that is put up in social media spaces gets attacked fairly quickly. So I think, I don't know if I can answer that question, but we've got to keep trying. I'd like to thank everyone for their thoughtful consideration and the questions that have come out today, actually.
Yes, yeah, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. With that, I think we can. Do you have any closing remarks, Dr. Godwin? Or
I don't know. Thank you for coming.
Okay, thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Friday, and have a very nice weekend.